potentially there was an assumption that people, maybe it's a correct assumption, that a lot of people just would be like, that's just the person that says things are racist sometimes, so sure, put whoever you want there, it's not a big deal.
Kia ora, Anna Rawhiti-Connell here. I'm a senior writer and head of audience at The Spin-Off, and I'm turning the tables on Behind the Story this week. Regular host and Spin-Off editor Madeleine Chapman joins me to talk about her story, Controversial Human Rights Commissioners Weren't Recommended by Hiring Panel. Hi, Mad.
Hello.
Welcome to your own podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's very lovely to be on the other side of this table.
Is this the first time you've been interviewed about your own story?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Okay.
This is a real indictment on my own writing there.
Yeah. I don't think it is. I think it's just you putting other people first. But great, now we can talk about a story that you have written this week. So you wrote something a wee while ago, which was kind of a top for your weekend newsletter that you do, The Weekend with Madeleine Chapman, asking whether you can be a human rights commissioner and transphobic at the same time. And it was would have been the day of, published the day after, Justice Minister Paul Goldsmith kind of did a late Friday afternoon news dump around who had been appointed as Chief Human Rights Commissioner, Race Relations Commissioner and Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner. And within 10 minutes, I would say, there were a number of us who were looking into the backgrounds of some of those people, some of us who were already familiar with the backgrounds of those people. And you wrote what was kind of just a quick opinion piece about, I guess, the credentials of the people that had been appointed. You then followed it up this week with some exclusive reporting, which was around what you found after putting in an Official Information Act request about those appointments. Do you want to just tell me what prompted you, what spidey sense was tingling following that announcement a couple of months ago to put in an Official Information Act request about these appointments?
I think anytime there's a controversial appointment, which the people in question, so there were 3 people hired or announced who had been hired, Stephen Rainbow as the Chief Commissioner, basically, Melissa Derby/Darby, I do not know the pronunciation, as Race Relations Commissioner, and Gail Pacheco as Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner. Of the 3, Dr. Gail was the only one that people sort of went, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
As a kind of someone who was a economics professor and obviously had a lot of background in this field. And the other 2 were surprising for a number of reasons, not just potentially a lack of experience, and sort of often commissioners have worked in some sort of legal field and particularly around community work. And they also have been quite, let's say, vocal or passionate about some culture war type topics. For example, trans rights. Mm-hmm. Both had made comments relatively recently that seemed to, at the very least, suggest that they were suspicious of, quote unquote, the trans agenda, which is just trans people really. And there had also been, Melissa had done speeches about sort of not believing in systemic racism and things like that. So there were just some things that felt very ironic given the job titles, Race Relations Commissioner and Chief Human Rights Commissioner. So immediately people were a bit like, how did this happen? How did these people get these jobs? And the first defence was, actually, the minister doesn't choose the commissioners.
That old chestnut.
There is, you don't blame Paul Goldsmith. It's usually a independent assessment panel, they make recommendations. The minister obviously does not have time to be interviewing these people or doing like personalised recruiting. He probably just oversaw the process and now here are these people.
And that's really common in government, isn't it, for ministers to have arm's length around certain appointments like this?
Yes, often they are sort of learning about the background at the same time as everyone else because they just sort of sign off on the action points and things like that. So I thought, well, there is a chance that that is the case, but there's only one way to find out, which is to request the information about the process, which obviously comes through the Official Information Act. So I believe one of our writers submitted while I was writing up my column. They chucked in a request to the Ministry of Justice for, I think the request was worded sort of like any communication between the ministry or any advice to the minister for hiring these 3 positions. And there was, of course, a delay because there always is. And then that OAA landed last Friday.
Right.
Again, lovely Friday afternoon document dump. So that kind of came in on Friday. There was a lot of reporting originally around the announcement. I think the Herald stuff, everyone picked up on, the new Chief Human Rights Officer has said some interesting things that might mean that he, I don't know, isn't the best choice for this role. So they reported on that at the time. And this OAA came back and a number of people, both journalists and MPs and private citizens, had requested this information as well. So everybody got theirs back last Friday.
So you published your first piece, that was August the 17th. As we often do, we whacked in an OIA request kind of straight away, and then almost 2 months later, you get the response. And we'll talk about that response and also the fact that there were multiple responses and multiple requests made. Is it common? I mean, you said, as per usual, there was a delay on getting information back, but I think it's worth repeating and talking about the fact that there are often delays that there aren't meant to be around OIA requests, and they're increasingly becoming longer and more is being redacted.
Yeah, so the Act does require that the ministry or whoever you have requested the information from as a government entity or role basically provide you with that information within 20 working days. They can also get in touch with you within 20 working days to say that they need an extension. I have yet to put in an OAA. I don't know anyone who has put in an OAA and had them just send the response back. Instead, every time it is an extension, no matter how limited your request is, that it can't be that difficult to put together. And even with them sending it back eventually, the interesting thing is a lot of people requested the same information, which was basically what was the advice given to the minister around the hiring of these people and what were the assessments from the panel. And we had quite a lot of redacted information in ours. I saw another one that was very similar request that had a little bit less redacted. Don't really know why there was a difference there. And then yet another that also asked for basically the same thing that had quite a crucial detail unredacted, which was redacted in ours. So there's also that strange thing where there's a lot of just fairly arbitrary redacting going on. And there was also stuff redacted that we thought this actually doesn't qualify to be redacted, but we would have to go and complain to the ombudsman and then that delays it even further. So that whole thing is a whole other kettle of fish.
I think that's the thing people don't understand is that even if the ombudsman says actually there was no reason for this information to be redacted, and you can quite often see that at the bottom of OAA requests, the onus is on the person who made the original request to go back and re-request the information unredacted.
Yeah, you essentially have to be extremely annoying to eventually maybe get the information that you asked for in the first place. So we definitely saw, I think we can talk about it. We saw various briefings to the minister about different hiring. You can see, here's the shortlist, here's the interview assessments, here's, do you want to confirm that you want to appoint these people? That was the last document, but there was clearly more happening after that, because there was what was put in that final document versus what actually happened is quite different. So obviously we did not receive some other stuff, but you don't know what you don't, we don't know specifically what those would be. So we would just have to go back and ask again. And it's a very long, it can turn into a very long process.
In looking at, is it common for you to go, if we put in an OAA request, is it common for you then to go and look at the responses to similar OAA requests and essentially do a jigsaw puzzle in terms of pulling the story together?
Yeah, that is essentially what you have to do. And so the part of the reason sometimes when you write a story is to just let other people know that you are looking into this thing.
Like a bat signal.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a bat signal. So because I had written that first piece right after it got announced, which was almost a bit of yes, we've seen this, we're looking at it. I did get a number of people sort of get in touch saying, I put in an OAA and I know someone else who put in an OAA. And then even after I published this story this week, there were people responding saying, well, my OAA said this. Mm-hmm. And then I went and had a look, because a lot of them are, they're available online. And I thought, oh, well, that's a different piece of information that wasn't included in our request. So it really, you get a lot of little details, and sometimes you go, oh, I'm going to basically figure out around the redactions what this might mean. And then someone else will go, oh, yeah, just said that. My one just said that. And you go, oh, okay, great. So, yeah, it's a lot of, it's basically, it's like a weird, for a while there were those artists on YouTube who got really popular by basically painting something and then turning it upside down, and you go, oh my gosh,
yes,
there it is.
Yes.
Looking at OAAs is like that, in that there's very little that you just go, oh, there it is, it says it right there. It's here's all the things it doesn't say, and by colouring around it, we have figured out, we have got a silhouette of a scandal.
An old woman.
Yes, exactly.
So once you had sort of turned your OAA painting upside down to actually find out what had gone on, I guess what was the primary finding around that appointments process?
The main finding was that Stephen Rainbow, the Chief Human Rights Commissioner, who will begin next month, and Melissa Derby were not on the independent assessment panel's shortlist. So they put out a call for people to basically apply, or not even apply, just express interest. Mm-hmm. And they didn't get heaps. It was a dozen for each role, basically, on average. And the independent panel, which was made up of not unfriendly national figures, Chris Finlayson was on there, Sir Terence Arnold was on there, they sent through to the Ministry of Justice, and therefore the Minister, their shortlist, which was 535 in terms of how many people they suggested. All of those are redacted because those are private citizens who applied and didn't get a job. So
fair enough.
Rightfully, they should be redacted. So what we've figured out was that because Dr. Gale's name was not redacted on the list, but every single other name was redacted, that meant Stephen Rainbow and Melissa Derby were not on the list, because if they were, their names would not be redacted. So that was kind of the first, oh, they weren't on the shortlist. And then there's a bit of blank space for redactions, and then suddenly there's an interview schedule, and Stephen Rainbow is on the interview schedule. And you go, okay, so somewhere between the the shortlist and the interview schedule, he got added on. So that's interesting. Then they have recommended basically hires for each of the positions, and it also, Dr. Gale is there, all laid out, so obviously was recommended. Everything else redacted. So again, 2 of them were not on that list of sort of, here's who we think should get the job. So we go, well, how did they end up getting hired? And
so just to clarify, they weren't on the shortlist.
They weren't on the shortlist.
Then when there was interviews happening, Stephen was there, but in terms of the recommendations
post the interviews,
neither Stephen nor Melissa, based on what you could deduce.
Well, according to the thing, Melissa wasn't even interviewed. So by the panel in that first round. So we thought, okay, so Melissa wasn't even interviewed. She doesn't seem to have even been a candidate. Stephen Rainbow was a candidate. He was listed in the appendix where, again, everything else redacted. He was listed as an alternative candidate. So not a preferred candidate, an alternative candidate. So we were like, okay, something happened there. We don't know what, but interesting. Then there is another update saying, here's a little update to the panel after you requested that Melissa Derby be interviewed. So this is months later where they're trying to confirm the hiring of each role, and suddenly it seems that Goldsmith had requested that this extra person be interviewed. So again, we went, interesting, okay. And that was essentially all we had from our OAA, was just at some point, like all we could say definitively was the panel did not recommend 2 of these people for these jobs. Interesting. What we figured out from other people's OAAs, which looked very similar but just with a few extra details, was that 1, not only was Rainbow not recommended, he was literally not recommended.
Right.
Like, in quotes, not recommended. And I think 2 people who were interviewed, who were redacted, were highly recommended. So something, again, you go, okay, so you've got 2 people highly recommended, this guy not recommended, and then he gets offered the job. So again, something strange there. Melissa Derby, we don't even know whether she was not recommended or not because she wasn't part of the original interviews, but we do know that 2 other people who were interviewed for the role were highly appointable or basically highly recommended. So it does seem like this independent panel did do what people said, which was independently assessed these candidates and made some recommendations, and the minister did not take those recommendations. And that's kind of where we ended up, which is essentially where we land with that article, which is here's what we know so far. There is more information to be found about what happened between the interviews and the appointment. But essentially it was kind of, I think there were a lot of people who were saying, well, it's all an independent panel and, this and this. But Goldsmith seems to have been quite involved. And since the article came out, Labour's Justice spokesperson, Duncan Webb, he said something about Stephen Rainbow not being on the shortlist, and Goldsmith confirmed that he had added him to the shortlist. So as kind of sort of bleak as the story is, it is quite funny to me that these like very highly respected legal professionals and advocacy professionals all said, here's who we objectively think is best. And then Goldsmith said, I'd like to add in this guy.
Yeah.
And they went, okay, fine. And then they interview him and they go, yeah, guy, we don't recommend it. And he goes, okay, cool. And then offers him the job. I'm like, what do they think in terms of their advice just being ignored?
Your story was published this Monday, and then Webb followed up in the House this week with a question.
Yeah,
for
I think
Goldsmith.
he obviously had his own OAA.
Right.
because he submitted his questions on Friday afternoon, last Friday. So he was quick, and his questions were very quick around, talking about the process, who was on the shortlist, why was this person added late, and he actually asked a question more recently that got answered, which was about It seemed that Paul Goldsmith had assumed or said that Stephen Rainbow had experience as a legislator.
Right.
Which is not true.
No.
But his response was basically, well, that seemed to have been incorrect, but that does not change my view of his knowledge of the law, which, I don't know.
I mean, sure.
I mean, I watch Boston Legal as well, but I don't know if that makes me a legislator.
A lot of shows about lawyers. I've watched Suits. I've got half a law degree. I could probably be the Human Rights Commissioner.
God.
So we start with, I guess, the initial response being there's an independent panel, they make the recommendations or whatever. And then a couple of months later, we end up with confirmation, essentially, that Goldsmith had added Stephen Rainbow to the list.
Goldsmith had added Stephen Rainbow after inviting nominations from the coalition parties. And Stephen Rainbow was nominated or passed on by the ACT Party. So that's that. And then Goldsmith has said that he personally suggested that Melissa Derby apply, which again, which we hopefully will find out with another OIA request, but there is obviously something missing there, because I had assumed, okay, they interview these people, again, it's all just working backwards, but they interview these people, Melissa is not in that list, and then after the fact, it's sort of like, well, we've now interviewed Melissa, it was all very late, and this and that, late application or something, and you believe that she should have been interviewed, etc., you've suggested her. If he suggested her after the interviews and after the panel was very quick, they gave their recommendations for who they thought was hireable within 3 or 4 days of the interview, I thought maybe they didn't recommend anyone. It's all redacted, but maybe they interviewed 5 people for Race Relations Commissioner and they went, which does happen, none of them quite fit the bill.
Yeah.
Maybe do you have any other suggestions? So that was my understanding. And then I saw someone else's OIA where that bit was not redacted. And basically they redacted the names, but they put, which is where we found the Stephen Rainbow not recommended, there were 2 people who were noted as being highly appointable who interviewed for the Race Relations Commissioner job. So he had 2 supposedly very strong candidates and then seemingly invited another person to apply months later. So that is also very interesting to me, and hopefully we can get a bit more information about how all that came about. But yeah, it feels a lot more like a government decision than what they would usually say, which is, well, we have independent people and we obviously, it's our job to recommend it ourselves and put it through. But there does seem to be a bit more involvement in this hiring process than maybe people would think for a role like this, especially because the Human Rights Commission is supposed to be relatively separate.
Independent to the government.
So it is kind of a strange one to have a heavy hand in as a government minister.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's why we've had people in the past who've had kind of, I guess, that legal or community advocacy background, because that is what people understand the role of commissioner to be, and that is what they understand the role of the Human Rights Commission to be. It's not operating, as an arm of government.
Yes, they're often supposed to be quite annoying to government, actually.
Well, you would think so. They are the watchdog, right?
So I'm not sure where Melissa Derby's name, she's founding member of the Free Speech Union, which is maybe says something, but
she's been involved, I think, in some of the government education policy review stuff.
Yeah. Him personally suggesting her is quite interesting, and he also answered another question from Duncan Webb, which was that he said coalition parties were consulted on the chief commissioner role. We don't know whether that means they were consulted on who it was going to be or consulted on possible candidates, but certainly there was obviously communication going on between the coalition parties around who might be filling those roles. Yeah.
So it's a real, I think the upside down picture analogy is good. I think kind of missing puzzle pieces is great. So I guess to wrap, a couple of things. One, why do you think they send different responses to different, I'm assuming it's outlets and people and individuals or whatever?
Mm-hmm. It is, the wording of an OIA request is like an art form, basically. Yes. It's a whole other language. And if you don't know how to word it correctly, they will come back and say, this is too broad, or we can't possibly respond to this. So there is a chance, that people had slightly different wording in their requests. But what is quite interesting is that most of the documents that got sent through were the same documents. Some just had more redactions than others, which that is quite strange to me. And I don't really understand whether it was they were processed by someone different or something. But and some of the redactions that were on ours that weren't on others were like quite crucial. That was where it said not recommended, that this person was not recommended. Otherwise, it was just sort of like, he seems to have appeared. Wonder what happened there, and that's it. So, yeah, the OIAs thing is an interesting one, and very aware that there are also, anyone can put in an OIA request. Some of them are very funny. Some of them do feel like a complete waste of time. So I can appreciate the people on the other end having to deal with these, like, sometimes quite ridiculous requests. But I think if we were so inclined, we could probably complain to the Ombudsman and we'd get a little bit more information. But again, it's just all takes time.
I guess the other one is government ministers, people in ministerial offices must have a sense that eventually a degree of what really happened will out.
Yes.
So why do you think there's a bluster to start with?
I think it's just, why not? If they can kind of avoid, just giving you all of their information, why wouldn't they? I think there is going to be an interesting piecemeal aspect to this, which is that in another, somebody asked at like a media stand-up with Goldsmith why he basically just put Stephen Rainbow at the front of the line despite not being recommended by these expert panel. And his answer was, well, they seem to be more focused on like the legal aspect and, knowledge of human rights law. This is a Human Rights Commission, by the way. And I was more concerned about the person being a good communicator.
That's right.
And that is a fine answer, except none of the commissioners, I would say, including Gail, who has done plenty of media, I don't know if anyone is famous for being a really good communicator. And I think him saying that is just like a go-to answer, which, we'll see when we hear communications from the soon-to-be Chief Human Rights Commissioner. But it does just seem like a bit of a stalling tactic because there's nothing to back that up. It was a person who had controversy for communicating poorly some of his ideas. So I think stuff like that where you go, this just sort of delaying, and I don't know, hopefully we will see a bit more of how exactly that came about in the coming weeks. But I did also want to note that I don't know if anyone else sort of picked up the story, basically, which happens, but I do think if it was a different type of role, there would be a lot more concern. I think the concern because it is, quote unquote, like a bit of kind of advocacy or supposed to be sort of representing particularly underserved New Zealanders, that the idea that people put in these people who maybe won't be particularly sympathetic towards those communities, that somehow for some reason feels less scandalous than if, let's say, some sort of something more finance focused.
The governor of the Reserve Bank, for example.
Yes, if we found out that the governor of the Reserve Bank did not even
for his communication skills.
Yeah, or like had not even made the shortlist.
Yeah.
For the interview panel.
Yeah.
I think there would be a lot more scrutiny on it, but I think potentially there was an assumption that people, maybe it's a correct assumption, that a lot of people just would be like, that's just the person that says things are racist sometimes, so sure, put whoever you want there, it's not a big deal.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think there is a range of views around, particularly within the media, around how anything that touches the sides of culture war or culture wars should be covered.
Yes.
Because there's a school of thought that believes it gives it oxygen, and then there's another school of thought that believes that actually it should be unpicked and called out. So, great. Thank you, Mad.
Thanks for having me on your podcast.
That was Madeleine Chapman on Behind the Story. She'll be back next week with another spin-off writer and another spin-off yarn. Thanks for listening.